As always, in our open hours, anything goes. And as always, there's lots we can get into this morning. Hope to hear from you again between 11 and 12 this morning. After the news at noon, we'll have a chat with Trevor Steinberg, the longtime coach of the St. Mary's University Hockey Huskies, 23 years behind the bench of the Huskies. Trevor's decided to call it a day. He's retired. And he'll tell us why and what he intends to do with the rest of his life when he joins me coming up after the news at noon. We'll also have a conversation with fisherman Darren Porter, who's on a one-man vigil right now at the Windsor Causeway. This is an issue, Darren says, fighting for fish passage. And he's blaming the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and the Nova Scotia government as well for that situation. And he'll explain when he joins me coming up after the news at noon here today. 10:33 is the time right now. Well, logs from Truro police obtained by CBC News show confusion during the April shooting rampage that saw 22 Nova Scotians killed. And we're also going to hear this morning that the gunman involved in that may have been a police CI, a confidential informant. Joining me this morning is Nova Scotia author and journalist Paul Palango. Paul, good morning to you.
Good morning, Rick.
Well, let's start first off with the police logs from Truro that the CBC got its hands on, basically suggesting that the RCMP was in a bit of a state of confusion as to where the gunman was going, what he was headed, what his intentions were. In fact, at one point they suggested that Truro police should stand down, or Truro police decided to stand down based on the information they got from the RCMP, only to discover later that the gunman was driving his fake RCMP car through the streets of downtown Truro. What do you make of all of this, Paul?
Well, I think the story by Elizabeth McMillan and Carissa Donkin is like they've been doing good work on this all along, and they'll continue to do good work. I think it illustrates what I've been saying from the first time I talked about this, that the RCMP was basically out of it. But they didn't do anything a normal police force would do in this situation. And in fact, I don't think there was really a state of confusion. And Rick, I want you to understand that everything I'm going to say from here on in comes from serving police officers, former police officers, members of the legal community, and citizens who are aware of things that have passed it on to me and other journalists. And that's where what I'm going to talk about comes from, okay?
All right.
So what happened at that scene, I think what's important, what they did in that story shows that the RCMP was doing nothing. But why were they doing nothing? One of my really, really good police sources says that between 12 and 1 o'clock in the morning, the RCMP had declared that it was a murder-suicide, and that really there was no threat. At 1 o'clock, as the CBC reporter reports, they put out a bolo, be on the lookout for a guy named Gabriel Wortman who may be armed. A bolo is sort of a weak sort of alert. And they're saying in this bolo he may be armed, maybe driving a car with a deco on it and stuff like that. If you see him, call the police. Well, they already knew he'd killed 13 people and that he was on the run. So why did they do this? So I take you back to the notion that they were declaring it a murder-suicide. How do we know that's probably true? In their search warrants of Wortman's properties, they're searching for human remains. His human remains, not anyone else's, because they'd somehow convinced themselves that he had committed suicide.
But isn't that part of when you come across a situation like that and you really have no idea where things stand at that particular moment, that's got to be an option you've got to consider anyway, the possibility, as his house was burning to the ground, that he might have been involved in that house.
Well, people had already reported to him they'd seen him in a police car shooting at them.
Yeah.
And the other thing they didn't do at the original scene, and I've had former staff sergeants calling me and yelling at me, we had 30 members at the scene, but they didn't block off the roads that he'd get away on. He went down a dirt road that was less than 200 kilometers away from when they were all congregated at the top of Portapique Road and not going down that road. And he got out of there and managed to go to divert and hide and have a little nap before he could continue down with his killing spree. But you had 30 officers there. Each of them has a Colt C8 rifle, which is an AR-15, actually an improved AR-15. They don't appear to have gotten together in teams. They don't appear to have saved anyone. Clinton Ellison was there for 3 to 4 hours in the bush before he was dragged out. Lisa Banfield has this curious story that she was in the bush for 8 hours. What was going on? What were the Mounties doing? And I think a lot of it has to do with they were essentially in cover-up phase, covering this thing up from the beginning, because I think there's the other part of this story. Like that, what happened we're talking about is an epic failure in policing, but there were 2 or even 3 epic failures in policing. And maybe it's time to talk about the second epic failure.
Well, and this leads to, again, your suggestion or your information that Gabriel Wortman was a CI, a confidential informant, to the RCMP in New Brunswick, perhaps. Tell us more about this.
Yeah, this all started with a story I wrote in the Halifax Examiner a couple of weeks ago where an informant said, we should look at, there's a bigger story here that's going to blow the whole thing up. And I looked around and I couldn't understand where he would be a confidential informant. And this has all been muddied by the RCMP too, which is basically played on, leading people down the wrong track, playing on the domestic violence angle, playing on the family's emotions, doing things to mislead you about what really was going on with Gabriel Wortman. And since day one, there have been allegations and suggestions from various people, not only to me, but to other reporters about Hell's Angels connections. But where would Wortman be, sort of connected to the Hell's Angels? I didn't understand this. And what would his value be? Well, eventually, some of the people started to suggest, well, his value was as a denturist, that he had access to medications that they could use to cut cocaine with. They had access to nitrous oxide, which they used for parties. But he also had access and ready access to presses and pill-making molds and things like that, which they could use in the illegal drug trade. But I still didn't get it until last Thursday when the RCMP held their curious press briefing, and you'll recall that, Rick.
Yep. But what was it about it that piqued your curiosity in regards to the CI information?
Well, in policing circles, there was speculation that Wortman was an auxiliary policeman, and that's what they were hiding. But that's not really a big deal. I mean, policemen and auxiliary policemen have done bad things in the past. And what they said was he's not an auxiliary policeman or doesn't have any other special relationship with us. And in my more than 30 years of covering the RCMP, right away that my ears went up. And I said, what are they actually saying? They didn't say he's not a confidential informant, which I had suggested in the past and in writing. They were saying he didn't work for us. And I started to look at it, I thought, what did that mean? And I said, maybe if he's a confidential informant, they might not have known he was a confidential informant, because the way confidential informants work, it's very sort of closed into the specific officer. Everything's a secret.
Yeah.
And other people don't know. So I sort of said, well, he's not here. What about New Brunswick? And what has happened in New Brunswick in the last couple of months that his cover may have been blown? And when I looked to what's going on in New Brunswick, there was a major arrest announced a week before the massacre on April 10th. 4 Hells Angels and Red Devils and associates were arrested, part of a group of 6. They went out of their way to point out these other 2 made members of the Hells Angels as being part of this large-scale series of arrests.
And that somehow Wortman had a role in that, or at least provided information to that, or?
Well, this is sort of the long road leading me there. So I got the arrest records for one of the guys, Robin Moulton, hardcore Hells Angel guy from Fredericton. And in that, his arrest information and his conviction information, there's mention of a confidential informant and his possession of a hydraulic press to press the cocaine and stuff like that. That's the kind of things Wortman would provide. I called Moulton's lawyer, T.J. Burke, who's a former attorney general in New Brunswick, and said, hey, I'd like to run this by you, that is it possible the CI was Gabriel Wortman? And his answer was basically, he told me to hit the road, he's not saying a thing.
Wow.
Which made me even more curious.
Surely. But even if he was a CI, how does that impact on how the RCMP responded to that shooting rampage at all?
Well, one group of people told me that Wortman was a drinking buddy with a hardcore criminal, possibly a Hell's Angel, in the Portapique area. And I couldn't figure out who that was until recently. And who that person turned out to be is a guy named Peter Allen, A-L-A-N, Griffin, O-N, not I-N, Peter Allen Griffin. Folks, you can look him up on the internet. Peter Allen Griffin is a notorious Hell's Angel who was arrested in Edmonton in 2014 as being part of a group associated with La Familia, the Mexican drug cartel, and MS-13, the vicious Salvadoran street gang. And when he was arrested, him and the people he was arrested with were found to have silencers and paraphernalia and money and drugs and stuff. And it was a Hell's Angels operation. When he got out of jail, in the last little while, he went back to live with his parents in Nova Scotia. And where did he live? At the bottom of Portapique Beach Road.
Yeah, across the road almost from where Wortman lived, right?
No, he lived at the other end.
Okay.
Near the water, near where a couple of houses were burned down and people were murdered. But the house he lived in was owned by his parents. That house was not torched. And if you look on their Facebook, they got away. Somehow they got away and avoided everything.
So what are you telling us here this morning, Paul?
I think Wortman's drinking buddy was Griffin. He was part of that group, and that was part of the RCMP undercover covert operation to keep an eye on Griffin and report on other people. But I think, based on what happened in New Brunswick, beginning in February and prior to that, there was suspicion among the Hells Angels that Wortman was an agent.
But again, I'm wondering how this might have impacted how the RCMP handled that rampage on mid-April. I mean, the fact that he was a CI, how would this have somehow impacted their investigation at all?
Because this is absolutely explosive. They have a CI who basically was a psychopath, who they were paying, probably through New Brunswick, probably through the Federal Serious and Organized Crime Unit, and he was out of control and spinning out of control. He was probably made by the Hells Angels back when the arrest started happening, because it's a small community. When something goes wrong in these criminal communities, especially in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, you don't have to look at too many people to figure out who the rat may be. And one of the clues to this is some of the things that, one of the things that happened was people made a big deal, reporters have made a big deal out of Wortman got a speeding ticket back in February this year. But if you look at that speeding ticket, as I have, and I have a copy of it, he got the ticket at 5:58 p.m. on a Saturday on Portapique Beach Road for going 1 to 15 kilometers over the speed limit. I showed this to a Mountie. You know what the Mountie said?
What's that?
That's not real.
Really?
He says, that's unbelievable. I says, why? He says, because no Mounties are working at 6 o'clock on a Saturday night. They're back at shift change. The shifts change over. They're all back home. And why would they be patrolling a rural road for a speeder? It doesn't make sense. And to boot, it was minus 27 degrees that night.
10:47 is the time. Paul Palango on the line with me here right now, talking, of course, about the rampage in mid-April and the RCMP investigation that continues to this day. Paul, stay there. I'm going to take a quick break, and we're back to hear more right after this. 10:49 here on this Thursday morning. Author and journalist Paul Palango on the line with me talking about the shooting rampage in April and his suggestion that Gabriel Wortman, the gunman, was a confidential informant for police. And Paul, that might explain why initially the RCMP notified police in New Brunswick, the RCMP in New Brunswick, before they alerted Truro Police and Halifax Police, for example.
Excuse me. I don't think they wanted anyone seeing what was going on here. I find it really curious why New Brunswick was alerted, which sort of supports my theory about this actually being a New Brunswick RCMP operation that went bad. And there were other things going on at that scene, like, for example, one of the things redacted in the information is that people can't figure out what it is. They know there's ammunition, firearms, chemicals, explosives, and something. What was the something? My police sources say it was grenades. That Workman was bringing in all kinds of stuff over the border and smuggling things into the country, probably under the protection of being a CI. Excuse me. One of those things was phosphorus grenades. And that the houses, the RCMP has said the houses were burned down with gasoline. My police sources say some of the damage was caused by phosphorus grenades, which are absolutely horrible devices. They spray out a gas, and then the gas ignites, and then you can't put the fire out conventionally. And I wouldn't think the Great Village or Bass River Fire Departments would be capable of dealing with a phosphorus fire. And that might explain why all the houses burned down so completely.
But again, I'm confused, Paul, about how this information impacted how the RCMP handled the response that night, April 18th, that Saturday evening when they first got the first call.
There's two things going on here. One is that the RCMP was inept in handling it to begin with. I think they were trying to contain it as much as they can and hopefully smother it and say, we had this under containment, somebody went crazy, da-da-da-da. They were hoping, as I called it, magical thinking, that somebody in charge was basically keeping things damped down. I mean, they were held back. Nothing happened at the scene because they had to contain it. Because this is an explosive story. And let's take it to the second day now. Once Wortman wakes up in DeBert and decides to go on his next killing spree, because there's really two massacres.
Yeah. There's
the massacre on Portapique Road, which basically may or may not have been attributable in one part or another to the RCMP's inability to do its job properly. Maybe the RCMP did all they could. Maybe they caused it by having Wortman in the situation he was. But Wortman, on the next day, went to Hunter Road. And he spent 3 hours at the house of Sean McLeod and Alana Jenkins. And no one has been able to figure out why he was there for 3 hours. What was he doing there? What was the purpose of this? People have suggested that he was there because Alana Jenkins had said something about his relationships and he was going to shoot her as part of his misogyny and domestic violence rage and blah, 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 blah. I don't think that's true. Maybe in part true, but the real reason he was there was for Sean McLeod. And it wasn't for his guns or whatever. Because one of the things I've uncovered is that McLeod, oddly enough, let's put it this way, let me rephrase that. Sean McLeod's mother was Audrey Kavalak, Kavalak from Spring Hill area. Let's go back to Peter Allen Griffin, the Hells Angel, La Familia, MS-13 guy who lived at the bottom of Portapique Road. His mother was Joanne Kavalak, same name. She appears to be the adopted sister of Audrey Kavalak, Sean McLeod's mother. So Sean McLeod and Peter Allen Griffin were cousins and grew up as cousins. I suspect he went directly to that house because it has something to do with Peter Griffin. He went there. I don't know what he did or what he was trying to find out, if he was trying to send a message to Griffin and the Hells Angels. We don't know, but the RCMP has hid this relationship because to expose this relationship would expose who Griffin really was.
Yeah.
And he was living on the road. Knowing all of this, Wortman then goes on, kills some other people, unfortunately, including Heidi Stevenson, who was left unprotected by the RCMP. We talked about this before. She shouldn't have been there. It's unfortunate she was killed. She just shouldn't have been there. But let's get back to what was going on in Wortman's head. I think Wortman was basically blown as a CI back in February. They were trying to cover up and desperately trying to keep him going. But by the time the arrests were made, or announced on April 10th, his cover was thoroughly blown. I suspect he was being threatened by the Hells Angels, or felt threatened by the Hells Angels. He started to act erratically. There are 2 reports of him withdrawing large amounts of money, $500,000 some say, $1 million others say, that was delivered by a Brinks truck, excuse me, to his denturist operation on Portland Street in Dartmouth. Either the day before or a couple of days before. What happened to that money? Did he have to pay it to the Hells Angels? Was he laundering money for the Hells Angels? What was he doing? I mean, there is a curious reference to a $100 bill being burned, found on his property. But I think he was under enormous pressure because everything was crashing down on him. He'd been found out as a CI at the Hells Angels. He'd messed with the Hells Angels, who have made it clear they don't like people doing that kind of thing. He blew up. And another, possible theory for this is maybe because the Hells Angels were after him, maybe he tried to make, and this is pure supposition, but maybe all the killings were he was going to try to blame on the Hells Angels coming back into the area, burning his place down, killing all of these people, burning all this stuff, but not, ironically, not touching Griffin's house.
Yeah, interesting.
The problem here, Rick, is the RCMP hasn't told us anything. They're playing hide the pea. It's like a shell game. They're not telling us what's going on. I've told you more now than they told me, and I say, like, if I'm wrong, basically, show me I'm wrong. Show me where I'm wrong. Tell us the real story, because there's no investigation that they keep saying we're protecting an investigation. Well, there was no investigation after Wortman was killed that didn't relate to Wortman that takes them 8 weeks to figure out. The only thing I can figure is the previous investigations, probably these ones in New Brunswick, that have something to do with it. And I suspect those are already blown, and I suspect the lawyers are basically going to say they used Wortman as a CI, we want our cases thrown out.
Well, you've raised some very interesting possibilities here this morning, Paul, and obviously if indeed what you say is true, this information is information that I think the public needs to know, and perhaps the only way we'd find this out is through a public inquiry, and we are expecting word at some point today perhaps, or tomorrow, about a public inquiry that apparently the Justice Minister of Nova Scotia has been communicating with his counterpart in Ottawa, and an announcement is expected, again, as I mentioned, sometime today. And boy, I tell you what, very interesting accusations here this morning, Paul.
Rick, can I say one more thing?
Yep, just you got about 30 seconds here.
Well, I just invite other citizens and any police, call your favorite reporter. Call Elizabeth McMillan, Carissa Donkin, Haley Ryan at the CBC. Call Harry Sullivan at the Truro News. Call me or email me. People have seen things. Don't be afraid. Tell us what's going on. Fill in the gaps. It's in the public interest that we know this, and we've got to force government to do the right thing and look at this seriously and not bury it in sort of, this is a domestic violence case. There's something else going on, and it needs to be addressed.
I appreciate your time here this morning, Paul. Thank you very much.